Hello and welcome to Beyond the Paradigm. My guest today is popular author and researcher Gary Wayne. Gary has authored two books, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 1 and recently Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2. In this episode today, Gary and I discuss who are the leading families in the world, and we also look at the role of the Jesuit order. This is the first part in a two-part interview with Gary. So please, first of all, if you enjoy this episode, give it a like. And if you enjoy this content, can I ask you to subscribe to the channel? And in order to know when the next part of this episode is out, please hit that notification button. Well, Gary, for the third time, it's a pleasure to welcome you back onto the show. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you for inviting me back, and so happy to be back, and looking forward to the conversation today, as usual, and hoping that again we're going to talk about some things that people may not have heard of, or a little bit fuzzy on, and or know a fair bit on, but things that we'll talk about maybe we'll just top that up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, like I was just saying to you a little bit before, you've got a lot of information. So, guys, you're going to have to strap yourselves in because Gary's going to come at you with loads of info. It's brilliant stuff. And I would recommend listening to this episode more than once because it's definitely going to be information packed. And the problem with interviewing Gary is he has so much to say. You need to really be ruthless in what you want to ask him because you want to ask him everything. I look at his books and I see the chapters. I think I want to ask that. I want to ask that. But I've got to control myself as well because you've got so much info, Gary. It's brilliant. So obviously you've wrote the second book and that's out now.
Yep.
And I think the first two episodes we did that book wasn't out. So we centered most of the well, it was around obviously your first book, Genesis 6
Yep.
Conspiracy, and then you've done a part
Yeah.
two. And one of the one of the thrusts of the book is bloodlines, because you talk about bloodlines a lot. And obviously that's important for us to understand. And one of the things that I read often in different articles is like people give a list of these bloodlines and there's various ones and there's the 13 families. And
Yeah.
I'm just going to read a couple of sort of lists that I tend to find that are the more common ones. And
Yeah.
obviously, people can debate these. So, one of them that regularly comes up online is this list is so you've got as the 13 families Rothschild, Bruce, Cavendish, which is Kennedy, de Medici, Hanover, Habsburg, Krupp, Plantagenet. I can't pronounce that
Plantagenet.
properly.
Plantagenet.
Plantagenet. See, forgive me. I'm a simple Englishman from north of England. I can't speak French.
Yeah.
We've
Some
got.
some of some some of your kings were Plantagenet.
I know, yeah. So Rockefeller, Romanov, Sinclair, Warburg,
Yep. Yep.
Windsor, which obviously we know is Saxe-Coburg Gotha. So that's one sort of common one.
Yeah.
And another one that I seem to find differs from that. Some of the names do come in, but one of them that's included in there, people would have definitely heard of it. So you've got Astor, Bundy, Collins, DuPont, Freeman, Kennedy, Lee, Onassis, Rockefeller again, Russell. Uh, Now this one, Merovingian,
Yep.
Van Duyn, and Rothschild. So in terms of them lists, how many of them names would you include in a list for yourself? Because I've seen
A lot of them.
Rothschild's definitely in there twice, and
Yeah.
Rockefeller.
Yeah. Certainly a number of them. And so, even with the last list, there are important names on there, but they aren't part of the 13. In fact, anything that's like DuPont or Rockefeller, for example, would be considered pseudo blue blood from North America. And we're sponsored by the Rothschilds to be their stable of agents to get US set up to be their attack dog to bring about world government. And so they have been intermarrying to increase their ennobleness, which is very low level, aka the word pseudo, which is not a very nice word, but it's how the purebloods think of the American bloodlines. So anything like DuPont or anything like that, just they're important, but only for the US, not for the world. And and some of them are new money, like Gates coming in and Musk, and again, similar sort of situations with them. So Rothschild is an extraordinarily important name, but not part of the 13. And the Rothschilds, again, as we said, they're synonymous with banking, and they sponsored the American pseudo blue bloods. Their original name was Bauer from Germany, and they changed their name when they started the London Bank, from Rothschilds from Bauer to Rothschilds, to get a step away from the Jewish sort of connection. So they are important. They are part of the banking arm created by the bloodlines outside the Roman Church, but they're not part of the 13 either. But they've been ennobling their bloodlines for a very long time, but still not in the top 13. So that's and the Merovingians on the third list is an extraordinarily important one, but you have descendants of the Merovingians that come through the more important names that would be in the 13. And even when you narrow it down to whichever 13 you think it is of older families, there's still some debate on that. Does that include the black nobility of Italy, that's part of the black nobility of larger Europe? And a lot of times you don't see much out of the Julia gens. And if people aren't familiar with that term, that's the gens of the original 100 senator families that produced Augustus and Caesar, for example, as a as an emperor. That goes back to Romulus and Remus, whose parent god was Ares or Mars in the Roman pantheon. So you have to keep in mind with the black nobility, as what you mentioned with the Demichis, that's a different bloodline than the Julia gens. That is Phoenician bloodlines that migrated along with many of banking and commerce to the Venice and Florence area. They would be more considered the junior uh, black nobility of Italy, but their bloodlines are probably just as old or older than the Giulia gens. And then you have a Fabia gens within the Italian one as well. So again, we want to be careful of that, in terms of narrowing down the top 13. And, when you have the top three organizations of the Royal Masonic orders, you have the 13 families at the top, then you have the 33 families, and then you have the 300 families.
Mm.
And that starts to encompass more of even the Greek bloodlines. So the Cretazens is going to be in there, as well as the Albigens of the Royal bloodlines. So Merovingian would have sponsored into them, ennobled into them, and they were considered the most pure and noble bloodline of such high level that even the Roman Church was said to be intimidated from them, and why eventually the Roman Church eventually overthrew them. So they have what they call a Quinitar bloodline that's drafted in. And that's kind of similar to a Minotaur, so a bull type of Nephilim type creature, but it's an allegory for hidden Nephilim or Rephaim bloodlines. And then that's going to merge with bloodlines, and one would expect there would have been, with the Merovingian, probably some De Vere in there as well, as you take the Anjou back to their parent uh, name. They're a junior offshoot of the De Vere, just as the Plantagenet is a junior offshoot of the Anjou, um, usually through female intermarriage of a pure blood that's doing a second sort of dynasty. And so the Anjou would take theirs back to Plantagenista. So Planta gene is the gene for the Anjou. And so when we look at the Merovingians, they also have Judaic bloodlines grafted in their mythos and their genealogy. So they have bloodlines of King Saul. They have from the Benjamites. They have bloodlines of David. Some say bloodlines of Solomon, but essentially the same bloodline as you go down David and Solomon. And then allegedly, what they believe, and from a Christian, I don't accept this, but I accept that they believe it, from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And that's the bloodline that produces the last Merovingian, that's Dagobert, who is going to be the ancestor for Anjou, the folk of Anjou from the Lorraine region, Godfrey de Bouillon from the Lorraine region, and Hugh de Payens, founders of the Knights Templar, who become the kings of Jerusalem in that bloodline that King Philippe Bourbon has today, the King of Jerusalem title. And the reason why they call themselves the King of Jerusalem is that Jerusalem was awarded to the Benjamites by Joshua in the time of the Exodus, and they get that through the Saul bloodlines. So Bourbon, which is another powerful bloodline, having the King of Jerusalem title through intermarriage, inherits that through the Habsburg Lorraine dynasty. That comes from the Lorraine with that intermarriage that includes the Anjou of Hungary. And you have two other rival Anjou bloodlines of the Savoy kings of Italy and of the von Habsburg, who vie for the Order of the Golden Fleecing King of Jerusalem title. They're not recognized, but they say they have a more legitimate claim. So anyways, all of those names need to sort of be factored in as well. So I would take the Merovingians off that list because of the ancient nature, and they sponsor and intermarry with so many of the royal bloodlines, like the Stuarts, which were the most ennobled bloodline of that time, that had not only the Anjou bloodlines and the King of Jerusalem bloodlines intermarried with that, they had all of the Tuatha De Danann bloodlines of the Scots, of the Welsh, of the English, and of the Irish. And then you had the Tuatha De Danann of the Norse bloodlines that also intersect in there, and they became the most ennobled one of that bloodline. And nowhere in that list, as I recall, and it was a lot of names on that list, was the Hanovers listed, which is the name of the Windsor bloodline, right? Which has other ennobled bloodlines. So I put 13 names forward in book one. But I recognize that's probably not the complete 13, and some of them may or may not be there. But a couple of things I would say is that, and I've dropped a lot of names already, is it's the older bloodlines that we need to consider. But I leave out the Merovingians because they branch into so many other bloodlines. So, Plantagenet is a very important one. That's an Anjou bloodline that also interconnects the presidential bloodlines in the US in many cases. But they're the junior offshoots. So I would say they're still part in their hierarchy of an older family. I would possibly include the Romanovs, but not as the Romanovs, because that's a junior offshoot of the Putyanin bloodline of the Scythian Tuatha De Danann Kievan Rurikid dynasty that created the first Tsars, and then with Vladimir the Great transplants a branch with the Putyanin bloodline that through intermarriage and through a female from the Romanovs, also part of a little bit wider on the branch on that, is a Putyanin bloodline, but because it's a female that is marrying a male from another line, it goes with the patriarchal name of Romanov. So I would put them in there as well for sure, because we have to keep open, whether it's true or not, that Putin thinks he's a Putyanin.
Yeah.
So that's why I would leave a crack open there. And that's his mythos, that his grandfather or great grandfather was an illegitimate offspring of a Putyanin in the 1850s, because the Putin name comes out of nowhere in the 1850s. And in that tradition, they keep part of the name. They're not going to live in poverty, but they're not going to be part of the inner royal family. So I would also say we need the Bruce in there, as it connects into the Rollo bloodlines, which became the Sinclairs and the St. Clairs. So that's an important bloodline that's in there. The Geezer seemingly is another very important one, which is in Normandy, which could be part or a branch of the Rollo bloodline, and likely is as well. So I would be looking to possibly include those names. Out of the black nobility out of Italy, I mean, you have Orsini, and you have several other
mm,
black nobility that you may want to consider there. That's of the senior black nobility. And I would put the senior black nobility in with membership in the Council of 33, and the junior black nobility, which is more banking and commerce and money, like the uh, I'm trying to remember the name of the not Da Vinci, but the Medicis that come from they're part of the junior black nobility out of Florence and Venice that may populate as well into the Committee of 300 families and the larger families. So, but we have to include the Hanovers, I think. We just have to because of the power that they have and that they are a very, very ennobled bloodline. And Prince Charles is on record, again, accurately or not, I believe he has the genealogies to prove it, but through the Hanover bloodline of Middle Europa and intermarriage between the Hungarian and Slavic dynasties, he says he's a descendant of Vlad the Great or
mm,
Vlad the Impaler. It's not Vlad the Great, sorry. And that's who Dracula is based on. And that bloodline, again, according to their family mythology, probably history, they take their bloodlines back to a Scythian tribe that Hercules sponsored, the Agrathi, if I've pronounced that correctly, which is part of the Herculides and Cretizens from Zeus. And another scioning in of a bloodline back to a fallen angel named Tamiel that they say is actually Kezidiah, that's recorded in the Book of Enoch, noting that it's thought that angels had up to 7 different names and titles. So possibly, I don't know, that's what they say. And that Herculides tribe is sponsored by Hercules, son of Alcmene and Zeus. So I think we need to maybe include the Hanovers as well. And that would include some important bloodlines out of Germany, like Cossacks and a few other houses in there. Um, and another frame of reference that people may want to have for these bloodlines is look at what shook up the world order with World War I and was completed in World War II. So this was a family affair, a family civil war. They're all cousins, whether or not it's the King of Spain, whether or not it is the, Wilhelm, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, the Habsburgs, the Windsors, who changed their name to Windsor at the start of World War II from Hanover, and the Romanovs, and throw in, some more important ones because they're all intermarrying and they're all cousins, and they are intermarrying just to keep some distance in the bloodlines to stop diseases, right?
mm.
But they still want to keep it within that most ennobled royale line of 13. So that would be a very tight circle that they're working with, and why they're all sons, and any or all, not all sons, but all from the same family and cousins. And so I would start working from there, from World War One, before the complete upheaval, and look at the bloodlines not only in Europe but around the world. So that's going to include the Puyan and Romanovs. It's going to include the Shah and Li bloodlines of China, and so on and so forth. But the 13 outside of Western Europe is different than the family hierarchies and organizations around the world. And there's a higher alleged 13 families of the world that would include those other old bloodlines from around the world. So I know that was a long answer, and I get asked a lot about everybody, all of these 13 names that are named in whatever book or articles being written about. It's pretty convenient. There's usually biases in it. Some of them will be correct. Some of them are the biases that are in there, but it's really hard to get to that top 13 because they don't want you to know exactly who they are. They don't mind if they're listed as much in, let's say it, the 345 as you go in the top 3 orders of the West. And that's a lot of families. So
Yeah. No, definitely right there where you say they don't want to be sort of identified, and you know that's what I mean. There is so many lists, and no one can give a definitive answer and say these are the 13. But like you said there, like excluding the Rothschilds, that'll surprise a lot of people. But it doesn't surprise me because obviously we're talking about families now who are taking their genealogy back to a fallen angel. That's what we're
Yeah,
talking about, aren't we?
yeah,
These are the real top
yeah,
bloodlines.
yeah. These are the pure ones. These
Yeah.
are the ones that are used to ennoble, and it's the celestial mafia godfathers,
Mm.
exactly who they and specific patriarchs of Nephilim and Rephaim um, that they take their bloodlines back to. So, yeah, I think it's important to understand that. So, if you see a family that's visible like the Rothschilds, and they are very important, but
Mm.
they're not anywhere near the top. They're just
Mm.
not going to be visible. So people will say, well, but King Charles is pretty visible, but behind the scenes maybe, but they give you this superficial thing that he has no power and no real money. Well, that's just not true, but that's what people believe because they put that propaganda out there. So, and you don't hear much about King Philippe
Mm.
Bourbon, who holds the King of Jerusalem title and
Mm.
is the chair family that seats the Order of the Golden Fleece, which was material that the gods would use for their bodies so that those oiketerian bodies, the dwelling place for a spirit, because angels are spirit beings, and the oiketerion is the soul and the body of the physical world. They didn't want that body to decay, so they would create special clothing that they called the golden fleece in Greek mythology to stop that decay so that that body would last longer.
What you mentioned there about Charles, like, and people think, oh, he hasn't got any power. Well, he has 1 hour every week where he has a meeting with the Prime Minister, one on one, and no one
Yep,
else knows what's said in that room.
yep.
So clearly he has power
Well,
because who else gets to do that?
yeah, I mean, that's just not just let's have tea and tell a joke, right? They're going to cover important things, and the king and the queen before that in the Commonwealth would do a similar thing. So the Prime Minister of Canada, where I'm from, has a monthly call with the head of our government, right? The king or the queen at that time. And again, it's not just going to be, well, oh, did you get some rain last week? They're not talking about that unless they're trying to cause more rain. And I say that in
Yeah,
jest.
yeah, yeah. No, it's yeah, people are very naive to think this. And this is one of the things I'm trying to get through to people is that, the way that the world works is not how it is on the surface, how you see it. I mean, me and my wife were in London last week and we got a visit to the Houses of Parliament, to Westminster Palace, and we went and sat in on a debate in the House of Commons and everything. And the Prime Minister was there and things, but you can just see it's just a game. It's just a talking shop. They haven't
Yeah.
got any power. There's no power there. And like me and my wife were listening to him, and and it's just like it's theatre. You need to look beyond these guys, these puppets, and that's obviously what we're trying to do on here. Now, you mentioned one name, the Orsini's, and we know there's a white pope, there's also a black pope, and then there's the grey pope. And from what I've read, it's one of the Orsini's, Pepe Orsini, who's said to be the Grey Pope. I mean, what's your research tell you about the Grey Pope?
Yeah, the Great Pope would be some, in sort of the allegorical understanding, is a blending of power of the black and the white Pope to get gray. That's kind of the standard thing. So Orsini's important within the papal bloodline, and there's a black nobility within the papal bloodline. And people should not be surprised to hear me say that because one of the things that the bloodlines did of the nobles of the Indo-Aryans, which means nobles of the giants, is that they populated the top two classes worldwide of the four classes. And so that not only includes the governing ship that we see with the king and the queen and stuff like that, but also the warriors that dominated the army, uh, also owning all of the oligarch companies versus the small free enterprise blacksmith type of things that would be in the third class. They controlled all of the education. They controlled all of the religions, and it was all through their bloodlines that they would have that. And we would know that today as the elite, which is a very weird word,
Mm,
if you ask me, and you could break that out into a compound word as Elites, as in Israelites or
mm,
Amorites. Well, one of the interesting thing that goes with the bloodlines is the I am plural, which was a bloodline of majesty, not only as it was understood in Hebrew for the Bible, but in other countries around the Middle East. And so, and I document this in book two. And so that would be not an ite in this case, because El is the Hebrew word for a god.
mm,
So it would be Elim, as in, the Nephilim, as in the Gibborim, as in the Horim, as in the Avim, as in the Anakim, on and on and on and on. And that would means, it's a select group that's superior in terms of abilities and qualities to the rest of the population. They're a group of people that has the greatest power and influence within society because of their wealth and their privilege and their inherited wealth and privilege by inference. They're a group of people who, by virtue of their position, their education, their genealogy, exercise all the influence of the society. So they call themselves that influential group that is going to be um, hidden. And so when we look at these royal bloodlines, we need to understand that royale is another word that comes out of two different sources that comes together. I use the term Rex Deus in book two, Latin kings of God. So royale comes from Old French, roi, R-O-I, or R-O-I or Y, depending on how you want to do that back into Old French. And, AL or EL. AL is a transliteration for EL as it shows up in like Baal, meaning Lord God.
mm,
And then that word goes back to Latin for regal and regalis, which is the root word coming out of Indo-Aryan for reg, which means ruler or a king. And so these are the rulers of God that have the divine right to rule that King Charles III just received in his royal inheritance
mm,
ceremony that goes back to shortly after the flood and to back through the flood. So this genealogy of people that control the Pope line are part of the black nobility. So one of the more famous ones of the black nobility are the Borgia family. There's at least two, probably three popes that were Borgia. And Borgia also shows up, and I cover Francis Borgia in book two. He's going to be Grand Master of the Montesa order
mm,
in Spain. And he's part of the Holy Roman Emperor's court of that time. And he's going to sponsor Ignatius of Loyola and get him out of jail and use his papal bloodline um, ancestors that are, or not ancestors, but relatives where there's still many of them living in Italy at that time and having great influence, and that they're going to sponsor them into the papal bull. And so it's the Jesuits that become the new Templars. And eventually Francis Borgia in 1565 is going to become the third Grand Master. And then between him and the King of Spain, they're going to be doing wars with the Vatican. They're going to bankrupt them, get control of the banking through the Jesuits. That Ignatius, I mean that Francis Borgia, as the Jesuit Black Pope, is going to be in power, and he's going to move that banking to Switzerland, where the Templar wealth went to the Knights of St. John, a sister organization that held all of the assets in France. Now, in Spain, in 1317, there's a new order that was set up by the King of Spain to collect the Templar wealth, which is which he named the Montesa order, Calatrava order in Portugal, Port of the Grail. And so all of that wealth was kept away from the Roman Church. And here you have this black nobility of the popes, that's the Grand Master of the Montesa order, who's going to get control of the banking and the Jesuits. So for the first time, we have a black pope on the white pope's chair. And again, you can infer by that that that's a blending that I started off with as being the gray pope in its allegory and in control of everything. And that's the first time. So the gray pope before had major influence as sponsored by other royales and or being a royale. And the Orsinis would certainly be a likely candidate for the Council of 33. But never was on the actual chair at the same time. So you had those three distinct groups. So the question that I would ask going forward is does that gray pope as we have it today continue? Do the Jesuits ever let go? And when do they go rogue again, like they did in the 1800s, and the Royals disbanded them, and they weren't permitted to come back until the French Royals imprisoned the popes in the 1800s, and in response, they recertified the Jesuits to push back on the Royal influence. So when we understand the terms in the allegory and understand colors are very, very important in the Masonic orders. They all have special meanings, and they have more special meanings the higher that you go. They use those colors as part of that taciturn language that they can do things in plain sight, and they know what they're talking about, what's being described, but most people don't know.
So you mentioned the Jesuits. I was going to speak to you about them because obviously you mentioned them in the second book. So the Black Pope is obviously a superior Jesuit. Just tell us a little bit about sort of
Yeah,
the start of the Jesuits.
he's the Grand Master, Governor
Yeah,
General, whatever title you want. He's the chief Jesuit.
yeah. So you mentioned Ignatius of Loyola.
Yep.
Tell us about him and what he did.
Yeah, so he comes kind of out of nowhere. He does have Basque bloodlines, which is interesting. Um, and in their mythos, I mean, as you dig into their family mythos, they call themselves Homo Atlantis, which is very interesting. And they say in that mythos that they begat the Egyptian religion, the Sumerian religion, the Scythian religion shortly after the flood. So there were survivors from the antediluvian Atlantis civilization, and then they settled into southwest, southern France and northern Spain. And even their language is distinct. It's distinct from the European languages. It's distinct from Indo-Aryan, and there's certainly a mystery there and a wonder that goes with those people. And when the bloodlines moved in from Europe, I mean from the Middle East to Europe, there was a hierarchy. The Basque considered the Middle East bloodlines as diluted, and not as pure, and therefore took a superior position. Thus came the Basque diaspora, to settle that sort of dispute of who's going to be in control of Europe. And so when we look at the where Ignatius comes out of, he's not this poor priest, right? He's out of the nobility, just as the Knights Templar founders are all first sons, basically, and second sons of the Royals who are founding the Knights Templar. And two of them are, yes, Cistercian monks. So all that means is that there may be third or fourth son if they're a monk, because they're not going to have a position within the direct government, but everybody has a role. And so you start to see that sort of organizational structure that goes with it. So Ignatius of Loyola, he is going to go through a transformation through initiation, not only into the seven sacred sciences that we cover in book one, and they're going to interpret his new religion through the seven sacred sciences, and they're going to be sponsored to become the new Templars to replace the Templars that fell in 1307, and to create the new Babylon and make sure they have control of the banking, and that it's there to convert Roman Catholicism into the new religion for the end time, which was the Templar dream. So keep that in mind in terms of the framework. And the initiation also comes through Mary apparitions, and that he's going to become a soldier of Mary, Mother of God, as she becomes called, and part of, even from the 400s with the Roman Church, but in a very high level way, with the initiation of Ignatius, and not just one vision, many visions, where he's going through this process. And so they venerate Mary very high, which is again part of, the Roman Church, where they take Mary to be the Mother of God and free of sin, which is maybe a step too far for most Christians, but that's their doctrine. And so he is there to start a new order, and to change the church from the inside according to his commission from that initiation. And so the partnership with Francis Borgia becomes very important, because they get control right out of the gates. And by starting about 1735 to 36 and into about 1745, there's a series of papal bulls that are going to increase their power, and they're going to have complete control over all the seminary schools and all of the education. So they're going to shape the views with their polytheist Egyptian interpretive slant to the Bible. And then they get control of the banking. Now, we mentioned in the early 1800s, finally the Royals are tired of this organization that they created that's gone rogue. Jesuits are behind assassinations, political intrigue. They're involved on things that they shouldn't have. And oddly, they were rewarded, if you don't know your history, being the forefront of the New World exploration, where they're controlling all the information and the wealth for the Catholic Church and for the King of Spain and the King of Portugal. And so they have a very, very important role around the world, right? But they get too much power, and they start to work their own agenda instead of the overall agenda. So the Royals move against the Jesuits, and they take them down, almost completely disband them, except for in Russia and in Germany, where they get a degree of protection, but they're not of influence. But then what happens is popes get jailed and imprisoned in France, and one of the popes decides that we need to bring the Jesuits back in about the 1830s, if I remember that date right. And they start to get more power and more influence as you get the introduction of the Mary apparitions with Lourdes and Fatima, and they continue to rise. And now that's a perfect blend or match the with the belief system of Mary in the Jesuits, except that the Jesuits don't look at Mary as mother of Jesus. They look at that apparition as Isis, as an allegory for another higher god, but that's an offspring queen of heaven in Egypt after the flood. And so by the about 1880s, they now have all the power restored to them that they had before they were disbanded. And then they start to take more and more control. And then in the 1960s, they introduced liberation theology, which is social masonry within the church. Same ideology that created communism and national socialism and anarchism, and what was placed into Russia and China to bring down two more pure level of bloodlines that they couldn't control, that the Western Europeans couldn't control, and also ended up taking down the Hanover bloodlines in Germany of the Kaisers. And kind of with it, you had a large diminishing of the Habsburg Lorraine bloodline as well. And you had the Savoys on the wane as well. So the Western Europeans in the 19th century or in the 20th century made a major political play for dominance against other bloodlines that we're going to see ramifications of as we get closer to the end time, because they're not gone. So the Jesuits in the late 60s, they start to merge from within the church to what the Club of Rome has created outside of the church to speed up the move to world government and universal religion. So the Club of Rome has the world split up into 10 groups. The UN does, and end time prophecy does as well, from the Bible, into 10 kings of empires. And that they became very much a left-wing movement that we see being reflected in the current Pope's doctrinal change
Yeah.
of the Catholic Church, and has placed them in a position and has said that he wants to be the spiritual center of the New World Order and government that's coming. And he wants to be able to be in a position to baptize aliens. I don't make this up. I have documentation on all of this. It's on Catholic releases. So
Crazy. Wow.
yeah, it's crazy stuff. And so they're trying to bring that all about. And in the 90s, you had the Medjugorje apparitions that initiated 6 children under the Mary apparition. And in about 2013 or 14, after Francis comes to power, he starts to move the process to officially recognize the visions and the teachings of these 6 prophets who have a specific date that they will come out on. Then that they were told back in the 90s on this, so they're adults now, and they were given a date where they're going to come out with 10 prophecies to convert to the true religion or be destroyed from the face of the earth. And that's in a form of a cursed prophecy. So it's predicting if you don't convert, this catastrophe is going to come, which means that there are either true prophets or it's a contrived disaster. So when I talk about the sorrows that happen in the fig tree generation, the last generation, these are contrived catastrophes, and they get stronger without getting too far into end time prophecy with the seals, which is 25% destruction of the world. Trumpets are 33%. As you get closer to the midpoint of the last 7 years, and the wrath, the Lord's wrath would be 100%, except that Jesus steps in lest all flesh would be destroyed. So these prophets are going to be coming out and doing these prophecies. Now, whether or not they're the only false prophets of the end time, probably not. But because, again, understand that this is going to be the universal religion of Babel that Nimrod imposed, and Babylon, as it's called in end time prophecy, is rooted in the Hebrew word Babel. And this is the Enochian mysticism, son of Cain, of the antediluvian world that restarts with the giants after the flood and with humankind at Babel. And why do you have the confusions of the languages? So we're going to have this convergence of these prophets, but also look for, and we're seeing that today. I get reports all the time around the world. I don't know how accurate that they are, but Hathor is one that is said that is initiating and making uh, apparition visits, and in the same image as with the Medjugorje, Lourdes, and Fatima apparitions. And Isis is another name, and Inanna of Sumeria is another one. Uh, and these descriptions are identical to the woman that's depicted in Revelation 12 as the sign in heaven. And and I cover all of this off both in book one, but again, as it links specifically to the agenda of the Jesuits as they move forward on, these, I guess they wouldn't be competing, but sort of merging beliefs to create the new Babylon, which was the Templar dream and why the Templars were operating from the inside as well as establishing the banking, and that they are trying to bring that about in a significant way beginning in Catholicism. Now, I don't think Catholicism is going to be Babylon. I think it's going to be part of the umbrella Enochian mysticism, but it's the one that really sort of kicks things off. It'll be a branch religion, just as Vaticanus Hill was a branch hill of Palatine Hill, which was a Sibylline Indo-Aryan um, center of the seven ancient hills of Romulus and Remus, where the Sibylline prophecies and priests and priestesses were located. So I think Palatine Hill is probably going to be the one of the hills of the capital. And it's important to know this because in Revelation 12, Babylon, the woman sits on the seven hills of Rome.
Mm.
And so it's going to be a center for the world. It will not only be a universal religion, it will be an economic organization that controls all the trade of the world, all the commerce. It will be a geopolitical organization because it controls the 10 empires until the midpoint of the last 7 years. And it's a city. It's said to be a city 9 times. We have to understand it in its entire concept and in the way that John was describing it. And you could look at Constantinople, which has seven hills as well. You could make a good case for that. But nothing has the mythos of the seed of Satan, which the seven hills were understood as in the Roman Empire and by the Jewish people.
So this is the end of part one with the interview with Gary Wayne. Look out for part two coming soon.